And good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Here I am, your Sensei Al Bob. And it's midnightish here on the eastern coast of America. And it's March 19th. I left you a nice little story that you love about my family's lineage, right? They were the ones who built the Gilded Age, right? Always being paid in gold. They were the robber barons that just went up the river of Hudson and took the Indian land without taking it. They rented it for in perpetuity. And then they married into that family of the indigenous people. And that's why if you go upstate, especially in the Finger Lakes area, where the Iroquois and the Seneca and the Onondaga and the Mohawk are, you'll find that most of them have blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin. And other folk, especially over in Seneca, kind of look Native American. And so there's a great deal of the Amish up there. And their presence is quite interesting. So after I talked to you, I had a few bars and a little bit left of my phone battery, and I called folks, and I called my oldest sister, and I had called her the last week of February and wished her happy birthday, and I called her between the first and second week of March and wished her happy birthday and told her that I was, don't have a car, don't really have access to, if the phone signal comes through the deep green, I can make a phone call, but otherwise I'm limited to that, so I may not be able to call her on her birthday. And then I called her today, and her birthday was Friday, and so she was all upset that I didn't call her on her birthday. But I called her 3 other times and told her I might not be able to, right? So anyway, so she proceeded to tell me what a great birthday it was and blah, blah, blah. And that was nice. And then I said, well, I'm going to, go have my eyes operated on. And she didn't really kind of, be too interested. She was telling me about other things that she's done, she's in her 80s and she's going to now do with what her life that she always wanted to, right? So she did what my parents wanted her to do, and then she was, rung in by her kids, and then she kind of, instead of setting them free, they all live within about 2 miles from her. So anyway, which is her decision, and the kids' decision, and they're quite the insulated family. It's kind of like a circus, and I used to be part of it when her husband left her with the kids. A good 5 years in the 80s, when the kids were in their teenage years, I would go there, pretty much regularly. And, it started out when they were, the oldest was 12 and the youngest was about 6. So I would go there, and I would go, stop at a place like the Dollar Tree or in New York, there's a area on the east side where everything is like the Dollar Tree. It's not that way anymore. Now, rich people live in 60-story condos where those stores were. Anyway, and I would, get on a train and go there, and I'd have candy and all these toys and all kinds, virtually to be destroyed that day, stuff we'd play with. And my connection to electricity, the last time I went there at that time in their life, I found these balloons they looked like flying saucers, right? And they were big, about 4 foot in diameter, and and you fill it up with helium, and they kind of float. Right? They're made out of mylar, very reflective. And anyway, when I got off the train, there was a store that had something that had balloons, and so I got 4 of these crazed balloons, and I had him fill them not all the way with helium, just a spurt, like maybe 10 or so percent, right? So they went totally, right? And then when I got to my sister's house, I unfurled them and I blew them up with a bicycle pump for the tire, and blew them up. And so they didn't take off, like a helium balloon would. They had zero gravity. They just floated in the air. And so they were like giant Frisbees. And they never kind of you could throw them a real long distance, and then they'd slow down. And then they'd just be there, Anyway, so we went down to the park that was kind of across the street from my sister's house, and we were playing with these things, like, flying them all over the place. And I took one like a javelin and just flung it, and it went right across the park and right very high on the air. And then it came to land on the high voltage lines that were on the edge of the park. And when they came down onto those 3 phases, the mylar kind of blew out the fuse back at the distribution point, and it knocked that whole half of the town out. Right? The police came and the fire guys came, and I said, "Hey, we were just, flying kites here." And so they just, brought us home and gave us a bad look. And my sister said, "I never wanted you to have anything to do with my children being bad." And I just spent 5 years being the singular male influence, because her husband's family, didn't want to have anything to do with him. And so anyway, so, that was fine. I had plenty of other things to do. And I, spent a good 5 years with those kids. So I gave them some good input, right? And so when they got to be, older, like in their, the oldest was about 17 and the youngest was probably about 11 or 12. My parents had me drive them up to their house, and my parents' thing was to be, we're so rich here, let's, they give them stuff and take them out, and then, embarrass them and tell them that they're lazy and stupid, right? Anyway. But in that period of time, of that weekend, was a long weekend, I was kind of burned out by my parents because I drove them all the way. I was stuck in a car with them. And my father was just in a typically bad mood. And normally I could, just not be there. If he's going to be a jerk, I wouldn't be there, right? But I was stuck in a car. I drove from Florida all the way up to Jersey, and I was kind of stuck there with him. And it was just really just insufferable. And, at a certain point, I said, "Oh, Dad, I don't really feel good." And it was right at this part on 81, because, I would go down to Florida from Virginia. So I knew the best way to go. And I kind of instead of staying on 95, I would jack over to 20, onto this county thing in Georgia, and kind of beautiful ride, beautiful view, and no traffic whatsoever. And pretty much you could go 55, 60, right? Which is on the average what you can go on 95, but there's nobody there, no traffic. And in the few little towns that you would go through in that 200 a 300-mile space between North Carolina on 26 and, right where Florida hits, you know, what's it called? Georgia hits Florida. Anyway, so I've been taking that route for years. So I had all kinds of places and people and restaurants. And so we went up and I was driving them and I would stop, right, at this, we went from their house in Florida to this place in Savannah that I knew really well, great fish restaurant. And I knew those people for like 10 years. And the people who made Savannah what it is came from New York, and they were artists that I knew. So I knew those guys really well. And anyway, that was our first stop. And my father was kind of upset because I knew all these people, and all these people treated me so sweetly. And because I've been stopping there for, years, and I would stay at their houses. And this one guy had a really great hotel, on the Savannah River that had the great view of the ocean, right? And so we stopped there, and I said, we're stopping. It's, wait, drive straight. I said, Dad, I can't do it, So you want to drive straight through? And he couldn't see, he couldn't drive. He was really, not in the best. He couldn't really drive. I mean, by this time, he had people driving for him. And so I said, Dad, remember the little deal when you're a good person? I said, I don't even have to, take you all the way up. Here we're in Savannah. I know these people. I can stay with them. They would drive me back to Virginia. And my father was just livid because my mother said, my mom could control my father. And she said, Ray, I want to stay here. And so that was it. So, we stayed here. And he just got upset because my mother loved the attention. And, Savannah's kind of I don't even know how to describe Savannah, but there's a lot of down low part of Savannah. My mom's a great gambler. And I had told stories to the guy who had the hotel, and he basically had a back room, gambling thing, because all these rich people would come and you really couldn't gamble. But, Savannah was this place that it was like New Orleans. It's the South Carolina version of New Orleans. And so, anyway, my mom was happy as a clam. She wanted to forget my sister. Let's stay here. And my dad, no, we have to go up, because he wanted to see one of his friends in New York. I mean, that was his agenda, to show his friend that he was rich, right? Because he bought a brand new car, an Audi, to to show his friend how rich he was. And that was his thing to do, right? Anyway, so, I take my mom up to the gambling place. The guy who owns the place sits down and talks to my dad, right? And listens to my dad can be, and that's where I get my gregarious storytelling side. My dad, he had an interesting life. So he had some pretty good, interesting stories. And my dad, when he's in his best state, he has this over the horizon attitude. Like he'll go tackle anything, right? And that's his best state. And if he could stay in that state without letting his ego take over, and then fear take over, and my dad, in a lot of ways, he wasn't, John Birmingham is totally collapsed by his internal, whatever. If you watch his videos, you can, I don't even have to describe it. It shows it right there. My dad wasn't that at all, but he did have this kind of where he would be over the horizon. He was great at being successful, starting, doing, getting going. He was a great organizer. He was a triple Virgo. But if he wasn't in control, he started, kind of getting, And so he was a good team player as long as as a bird colonel, he was great. He was in the Air Force. Why he was so successful is that he picked out people who had real good skill sets and then let them do what they did best. And he didn't micromanage, right? And so he took all the credit, and so that was my dad. And I have my father's organizational skills. I have my father's over the horizon dynamic, and I have my dad's ability to pick people who, you know, have a good, a talent, a skill set, and then giving them the opportunity to shine. Those are my father's three best characteristics. And then his other ones are he was very gregarious, right? And he was very, like I said, a good storyteller. But the problem was his gregariousness and storytellingness was so, I don't want to say fueled by alcohol, but, he had a little tinge. But he was very good. He realized that alcohol wasn't good for him. But he would have he would order a double, single malt scotch, and he would drink it all night. He would have a glass. He would order the double scotch and a highball. He'd order a highball glass with ice in it, and he'd order another glass with ginger ale, right? And he would have a lemon and a lime, and he'd squirt the lemon and lime into the ice cubes. He would put, a tenth of his double, scotch into the glass, and then he'd fill it up either with water or that ginger ale or a little mix. And that's what he would drink all night long. So he would get a bit of a buzz and be gregarious and tell stories. But he would tell the same stories over and over again. Now, he had experienced a lot of stuff, but it was stuff, in the military, he couldn't really talk about it. He could after he retired. All these guys had war stories, but he didn't talk about it because this was another, problem my dad had. He was, he worked for, Groves of the Manhattan Project, and he worked for Mr. Strategic Air Command, General, what's his name? Curtis LeMay. And between those two guys, they incinerated the world. And my dad facilitated it through his amazing skill of being an organizer and, running organizations. And so he had real serious, PTSD from that. So, and that was one reason I took care of my parents, because I didn't really grow up with them. I grew up with my grandma, right? And then, miraculously, I was murdered by a Nazi nun in the first my mom put me in this Catholic school, first grade, and this nun murders me. And then I end up spending 18 months in this amazing facility in Garden City, which was a sanctuary of the Maryknolls. And my mom, way before she even met my dad, she was running Roosevelt Hospital, and it was during the Depression. So no one had capital, but a lot of the rich people had stuff. That was what they had. They had assets. And so she would, she was running this nursing school, and all these old, rich people needed somebody to take care of grandma and themselves, and that. So she would take her nursing girls and rent them out, right? And so those rich people would give her stuff, fancy clothes and stuff like that. And this one guy, he had built the place in Queens where they have the tennis there. They have a big tennis stadium, and he built kind of a gated community, like tall apartment buildings and houses and shopping and all kinds of stuff. It starts with, it'll come to my mind. But anyway, she got this apartment in there that had 18 bedrooms and a ballroom and a library. And, it was an amazing thing. And so she, brought all her brothers and sisters, all 8 of them, down to New York from upstate New York, because they were barely staying alive up there, and got them jobs, right? And she had this great place for them to stay. She always had food, and clothes. And every Friday she would have these dances where the prettiest of her um, nurses would get dressed up in the fancy stuff, and these rich guys, these swells from these, you know, ne'er-do-well families, would come to her ball, and the girls, I don't want to call them prostitutes, but they were like, dancing partners. And that's how my mom, took care of her family and her friends and made connections politically like you couldn't believe. And that's Tammany Hall still kind of existed. And the Catholic Church was not a spiritual entity, but a political monetary entity. So that's why my godfather was Cardinal Cushion, right? So during she was having these dances, all these swells, guys in tuxedos would come and they would dance and then go back to the girls' rooms, blah blah blah. And my mom gathered more and more and more. She was almost like Jeffrey Epstein, but not as sleazy, right? Not as disgusting as that guy. But she was, of course, like I said, she was way more powerful than my dad. And my dad was, when he was in high school, he played professional football. He was an amazing football player, right? He was quarterback, he was halfback, he was running back, he was defensive end. And there were stories of, big things in the New York Times. And when he went to college, he went to 8 different colleges because college football was more profitable, made more money for the mob, because of the gambling, than professional football, because professional football was just starting, and it wasn't as well. Didn't have teams, didn't have rivalries, didn't have it on the radio. Only college football was on the radio. So my father went to about 8 different colleges, and they paid him. He'd be at this one college, they do really good. This other school would offer him money to leave that college and go play for them. And so, he started out before the Depression in the late 20s, and then the Depression came, and he stayed, he spent, 4 or 5 years in there. And when he was at one of these colleges, I think it was the military, Virginia VMI, he was there, and he always loved uniforms. So, he was there, and the Army Air Corps was just getting started. I mean, it was in World War I, but they knew World War II was coming. So they were, so he was there, and they said, you would be perfect for the Air Force. And so one summer he went with his best friend, a football best friend, and they, went to the Army Air Corps training. They took all the tests, and they, went through basic training, and they accelerated, through the roof. But when it came time to fly an airplane, you really have to have it in you. It's not like driving a car. I mean, it kind of is, but if you don't really have it in you, it takes a lot of training to get you up to snuff. So this was during the Depression, and the Army Air Corps had a very limited resources. So they said to my father and his friend, listen, you guys are at the top of the testing, your intellect, and your skills of you will make great officers, but you guys aren't going to fly airplanes. That's not in you. But we're going to put you on the list of, when we need guys like you, we're going to call you first, and you'll shoot up in rank. And so, these guys went back to going to college and playing football and making money that way. And then when the New York, World's Fair happened in 1938, I guess it was, Grover Cleveland and Robert Moses, that was another one of their, building brilliant things like highways that destroyed poor people. Anyway, so my mom knew Grover Cleveland, and also knew FDR because he was governor of New York State, and because that was the swell groove she was in. So when she was running the Roosevelt thing, she made all these amazing political and rich people connections. And one of the people and my mom was gorgeous, and to the day she died, she was gorgeous, right? She never got fat. She was really curvy in all the right places, and she, knew how to dress, and she had tremendously long hair, and she would, she looked like a queen wherever she went. I would take her out shopping, to Walmart's, and she looked like, better than Queen Elizabeth or any other queen. So anyway, everyone loved her. Everyone curtsied around her, bowed, and she could play. She could count cards, and so she would go. When I was a little kid, she would take these journeys to the gambling houses of New York and the legal gambling in Jersey and down on the shore. And a number of times they have actually took her out to Las Vegas. And she took me, her best friend Gracie, my Aunt Gracie, and me would go on these 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 journeys, and my dad was down with it because he had his own other thing, right? And so my parents actually got along really great, and they never talked to each other. My mother was the admiral of the Navy, and my dad was just the captain of the ship. And they really shouldn't have had kids. But I guess that was one of the things that kept them together. So that's why they had kids. And they're Catholic, So anyway, I was the last one born, the youngest of all of them. And I electrocuted my mom when I was 6 months old. And that's why I was handed off to my grandma, right? And I stayed with my grandma until I was about 7, till about first grade age, right? And she was getting pretty old by then. And she moved out of her place in Harlem because my grandfather, her husband, was a world-famous barber surgeon, right? And, the barber pole's got the red, white candy cane. Well, that's because the barber surgeons used to do surgery, and they would bandage you up, and then, they take the bandages off and wash them and put them on the line, and they were always kind of still covered in blood. And anyway, so that was my grandfather. He was brought to the United States by J.P. Morgan to be J.P. Morgan's barber surgeon because J.P. Morgan had syphilis, and his nose. When you get syphilis, one of the first things that goes is your brain. It goes. But your nose, the thing that you can see is your nose. It usually turns into a gigantic radish with all these blood vessels, and it's really disgusting, and it's pussy and everything. And my J.P. Morgan went over and got him and offered him a thing that he couldn't, J.P. Morgan said, listen, you've got a great thing going on here in Rome, and you make a lot of money, and you're really respectful, but I'm going to bring you to America. And I'm building this big fancy hotel in New York City with, General, what was it called? There's two big fancy, at the time, hotels. One was, anyway, the names will come in, but they're the two big fancy ones. And the one that J.P. Morgan was right on Fifth Avenue. The other one was kind of set back a little bit. But anyway, Fifth Avenue, right near Central Park. And anyway, so he got the barbershop, right? Never had to pay rent, right? All he had to do was go up. The first thing he did was he'd go up to JP's, room. He had the whole floor, top floor of that hotel. And it was the biggest, fanciest hotel of its time. And the name of it will pop in my mind. And my grandfather got this amazing barbershop that faced Fifth Avenue in Central Park, and the sun was amazing. It had a big mezzanine. It was gigantic. I think it had 12, chairs, and he had 12 barbers, and he would go up to J.P. Morgan, and J.P. had his own chair up there in its own little barber nook. And my grandfather would kind of, scrape his nose and cut it and clean it. And so it would look like semi-normal nose. And J.P. Morgan basically had serious syphilis. And, he was the man who was running our economy while he was being, suffering the mental disease of syphilis in the brain. And we've had plenty of presidents that had that. Woodrow Wilson's a good example. And there have been other, and there have been a number that were, and that are still living today and were presidents. And you can see them, and their skin usually turns to this white opaque thing, so they have to paint their skin, right? And so anyway, so that's my grandfather. And they had another house in Freeport, Long Island, which was where back in the day when movies first started, they weren't done in California. They were made because Broadway was in New York, and vaudeville was in New York, and publishing was in New York, and music was in New York, right? And so when movies came along, World War I happened, and they had a number of big aerodromes where they trained guys to go fight, right? And so they had these gigantic hangars, I mean gigantic, like the size of football fields. And then after World War I, they weren't used for anything. And so, and that's why Grumman Aerospace was out there, and that's why Sperry was out there, and Lockheed was out there, because they were building and making airplanes during World War I, and that's why they got the roots. So those big aerodromes were, movies were made there because they did have, they had big skylights and in big areas that you could build, a town inside of these things, like scenery, and then make movies, right? And so this place, Freeport, every Island Barter, all the big bands, the guys, they had houses on the Great South Bay, and and Freeport had all these inlets. It was like Venice. And so there were really rich people. Before Southampton, Freeport was the place, right? And it was also a port, so really interesting stuff that didn't go through customs went into Freeport. So it was kind of piratesque, and it had all these rich, guys who were crooks anyway. And all the movie people and all the Broadway people and all the music people and all the vaudeville people were there. And so my grandfather was, J.P. Morgan built a pretty tall bank for, like it was 20-story in the 20s when they got, gaga about steel and concrete. And they would just shoot these buildings up very quickly and very cheaply. Right where Long Island Railroad was, right there on Fremont and Sunrise Highway, they built a building that looked just like the building down on 16th Street where Union Square is. It looks like an anvil, right? And so J.P. Morgan built a thing there, and that's where all those people came and got on the train to go to work. And my grandpa had a barbershop right there, and all those guys would come and get their shave. And so he had to, a place in New York City and a place, and so they lived up in Harlem, which was actually quite nice, still is. All the rich people went back. And so that's what I grew up in, that kind of culture, right? Like when I was really little, I'd go to work with my grandpa, and I was the kid. I was like a little monkey. I would go, they had everyone who would come in and regularly get a shave there, they'd have a cup with soap in it and a brush. So for hygiene, Mr. Smith had his own cup and, had a lid, and he would get, my grandfather would use that cup and set them up and shave them, right? So my job was to run up and down this ladder and get the cup, because about 200 guys would come in and get a shave every day, right? And so they would pay my grandpa because he was great at it, and he would make them look amazingly good, no matter what their skin was or any of the above. And he, so he would get actually, $2. $2 in the 1950 was a lot of money. And so that's what he charged for a shave. It was $2. And a trim, if you want to get a trim and not a haircut, but just a trim, like go after those wild weasel hairs, a trim and a shave was $3.50. And I got a nickel from every one of those guys to, get their mug. So, and my grandfather died when I was 6. He just keeled over in the barbershop. Bang, right? And that was the end, they didn't really invest. They really didn't do any of that. And so when all of that went down, he no longer had the place, he was no longer a barbershop. So my grandma, they had their house in Long Island, and the place in Harlem wasn't theirs, right? It was J.P. Morgan's. And so she kept that until 1960, when the bank realized that, so they sold it to somebody else, and those people, whoever was there, they threw them all out, and it's there was still a good deal of books from J.P. Morgan's library, right? And I mean, it was really bizarre how that all went down. So my grandma ended up in Freeport, and my dad and her other 2 sons lived near there. So, that made sense. Grandma's now kind of near them, and I still live with her. And, she had a very nice house, but it was starting to turn into a black neighborhood. And that's where I kind of, in Harlem, the same family, the Green family, when they got kicked out of their apartment, my grandma said, well, why don't you come down and there's 3 or 4 houses right next to my house, and you guys can move into those. And they did. And again, it was one of these things where my grandma didn't own this property, but it was like within her purvey. And then when I got to be about 12, and I was no longer living just with her, somebody said, oh, but, look, there's something, somebody bought it for nothing and kicked everyone out and turned them into like SROs for really low. Because the people who were living in those houses weren't like, scumbag, drug dealer kind of black people. These were all people who had jobs in New York and, took the train and all of that. And so even in Long Island, there was Jim Crow. It was quite bizarre. So, meaning on the trolley, because I had a trolley that went from Islip all the way to New York on Sunrise Highway, and my grandma and I, we would when we would go into New York, we could go on the train that would zip you into Penn Station in 20 minutes, right? Or you could take the trolley and it would take 2 hours, but it was such a great ride, and you could get off and get on, you get off and get on. And often we would get on the trolley with the idea that we were going into New York to visit friends, but we never really quite got that, because we would stop at Traps, or we'd stop at the big movie theater, or we'd stop and do some shopping, and she'd want to carry that around, so we'd just go back home. Anyway, so that was my life, and I was always sick, and I always died. I died about 4 times between birth and when the nun murdered me. And me getting murdered by the nun was a great blessing, because it broke that. Meaning, I was either going to die then or I didn't. And Dr. Black took really good care of me. And there's these other great surgeons that, you know, my godfather, Cardinal Cushing, he got me taken care of. And one of the people that came from my mom's life of having the big fancy apartment and balls and the rich guys like flirting over. She always had crowds, rich men, and just and there was this one guy named Thomas Merton who loved my mother, just loved her, and and he loved more the vision of what she was rather than my mother, because he never even got close enough because he would write her poetry and write her songs and sing it at her window. And he would just, I want to marry you. And she goes, oh, Tommy, I can't marry you. You're a Methodist. You're not, you're not a Catholic. I can't even, go out with you because you're, if you were Catholic, yes. Anyway, so he came from a well-to family, but he wasn't rich like these other guys that my mom was. And his family definitely didn't have the political power that my mother was catering to. But she liked him, and so he decided he was going to become a Catholic. And then he became a Catholic, and my godfather, Cardinal Cushing, kind of realized that this guy is a smart guy, so he's going to, and this is like not when I was born, but like the 30s, 40s, 50s, before I came on the scene. And so Thomas Merton became probably the most celebrated theologian, Catholic theologian in the 20th century. And when he became a Catholic and then became a priest and then became a famous author and powerful spiritual, as writing goes, he was, people talk about, people like, the guy who wrote, how to influence people, I forget that guy's name, but he was a theologian that taught modern psychology and how you can use theology to get what you want. And that became the prosperity churches, His name will pop into my head. And there were other guys who were, like my godfather, Cardinal Cushing, who's one of the first guys who was on television, being a Catholic, proselytizer, right? But Thomas wrote, and he spoke. He was a great spoke, but he didn't want to be on TV. He didn't want anything to do with the media except print, except publishing his books. And the Catholic Church loved him because this guy was selling millions and millions of books, and the Catholic Church got all his money. He lived well, but all that money went to the Catholic Church, and he did great things, like he brought the cloisters, He studied in France for many years and all around the world. He was in Tibet, and he was writing new theology. He went and studied, the epistle of Judas and the epistle of Jesus. The New Testament, Luke and Mark and Matthew and all those guys and Paul are all writing about him, but Jesus never writes anything. He was the most literate of those guys. And he did, because after, he got off the cross and came out, we're heading into Easter, and the girls, his apostles, they ran away. It wasn't until he came back, and they still didn't believe it. They didn't understand really what he wanted them to do, but the girls understood it, because Mary Magdalene, his girlfriend, his wife, she came from, in the Jewish tradition, you have the Talmud and the Torah, and you have the esoteric, right? And they call that, it'll pop into my mind, the esoteric Hebrew term, But, like Madonna was stunning it. And when I was in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, my landlord was a rabbi, and he was one of the more powerful rabbis. And he was a Hasidim, and he had his own Lubavitcher. And he used to come up to get my rent, and he did it because he just liked hanging out with me. And he would bring some good schnapps, and he actually liked smoking herb. And, he had a good business because he was, the Hispanic guys who were selling herb, they were all kids who worked in his factories. Hasidim had all these factories. Before China made all the cheap crap, the Hasidim were making it in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and Red Hook. Anyway, so I, went to his Lubavitcher and studied, the Talmud, the Torah, I was, the Lubavitcher is where you train to be a rabbi, right? And so I got to be known as a rabbi. People call me rabbi, and some people still do. And so anyway, and I got very deep into, Lubavitcher and Hasidim, those two communities. They, I wasn't quite, I didn't wear the pass and the yarmulke and all of that, but I was well-versed, well-studied. I could read German and Hebrew and Greek and Latin and other, I was playing with Babylonian and Egyptian, old, right? And because I was really into codes, right? Signal codes, because my dad was in the Air Force, and I kind of stumbled into the intelligence motif of codes, right? And it goes right in there with the whole dynamic of electricity, right? And that's how all of these languages were always very electric to me, right? They were like currents. And my reading of of all the sacred books, I don't see them as, the Old Testament is basically the Torah, and that is basically a legal document, right? And the Talmud is that more, but it's for the high holies, right? And if you read Exodus, God explains how he wants his temple. I mean, goes into great detail about every room and where, the Ark of the Covenant is going to be kept and who can do what. And, there's the public arena, and then there's the place where the everyone, gathers for a Sabbath and Friday and Shabbat. And so it's very, 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 very organized. And it's turned into basically, Moses was, he brought the law. But see, it wasn't the law. The Ten Commandments, they're commandments, not laws. There's a subtle difference in there. And how are we doing for Jews? It won't tell me. But anyway, how long am I doing this? 48 minutes. There's 3 of you still watching. How about some thumbs up, guys? And, Miss K, for my last show, left some really sweet comments. Why don't you guys try and do that? But anyway, so Thomas Merton became my other spiritual godfather. So I had 3 spiritual godfathers. First, Cardinal Cushing, who wanted me to be a rocket scientist for the Pope, because the Vatican owns science, right? And if you go look at NASA and JPL, a good deal, I would say a third of their, I don't know about today, but the guys who were really smart and put us on the moon and on Mars were Catholic priests and Catholic nuns. Yes, right? And black people. And there were a lot of black engineers there in NASA. So anyway, so I was exposed to all of this, right? So that's why I am your sweet, Sensei Al Bob, your griot, because this is all what I grew up in, all of this, right? And I have my skill set, so I have all of the best parts of my parents, right? Both of them, right? And I have a little bit of their niggly side too. And that's why I took care of my parents, because I had nothing to do with them. I had all these other people who took care of me, my grandma, and all these other people who weren't like my blood, but they took care of me more than my parents ever did, that's for sure. And they were a lot more healthy and wholesome. And they were thinking more about, yes, they all had these ideas of what they wanted me to be, but they did it in such a way that they appreciated who I was. They didn't try to beat me into submission and hit me like on an anvil to force me to be something they wanted me. No, they just said, he has a skill set for this. I will give him the opportunity to exercise it, not to be controlled and beat. So every time. So when I got into the higher elements of the Catholic Church, I remember going into seminary, as a freshman in high school, and this was a serious seminary. I mean, everybody went there, and they were Catholic, right? And boys, there were no girls there, just boys. And I got into this place. The guy who ran it was going, I don't know if he's really. I don't know. But his boss, the cardinal, said, no, he's going here. So I went there. And I didn't fit into because virtually every boy who was there, they had uncles or fathers who were there. And because it was a pretty sick place, you hear all this stuff about Catholicism and priests and boys. Well, this place was that to the 10th power. And it was accepted, right? And they had slavery there. They had indentured servants, right? And when I wouldn't go along, and they were trying to force me, beat me into what they thought I should be, oh, this guy's from the cardinal. It's like we have this golden nugget here, and we're gonna put it on the anvil and beat it into what we want it to be. So I didn't last more than 6 months. Because I rebelled. I mean, I didn't realize I was a rebel. I was just always, interested in physics and science and electricity and people. So I'm a sweet guy. I had all these people I'd stumble into, and they'd like, well, you want to do this? Like Grandpa Stoll and Mike. They made me an electrician. By the time I was 11, summertime, I was such a good mechanic that actually, Grandpa Stoll could send me off to fix things by myself. At 11 years old, I'd walk around New York City with a little bag of tools, going into factories, fixing these old ancient machines, right? And that's really where I got my chops on being an engineer, mechanical engineer. These things were like Rube Goldberg, like you couldn't believe. And that's where I got my real good sense of logic, right? Because these things were Rube Goldberg, but very logical. So they were like a Jewish golem. Go look that one up, right? And so by the time I hit that place, I was already an adult, and I was injected into an environment where everyone acted like children. All these priests say, you got to do it my way. All of this stuff. It was so childish. And I just looked at them, and they couldn't bully me. They couldn't do anything. And I was not scared. And I would go hang out with Cardinal Cushing in his apartment in, St. Patrick's. And, people see St. Patrick's from Fifth Avenue. It's directly right across the street. And there was the Rockefeller Center. I mean, there was, that didn't just happen by happenstance. Anyway, so they had archives and underground things like you can't believe under St. Patrick's. And so I would go. Grandma and I would go have tea with Cardinal Cushing, and I would camp out there sometimes, right? And so, especially when my parents still lived in Long Island, and I was still, I started working for Grandpa Stahl in New York when I was 9. So they had a place in New York, and they had a place in Long Island, just like my grandma. And then for when they moved at this period of time, they they gave up their place in New York, right? And for about 15 years, they just lived in Long Island, and they also were like all over the place. When my dad was still in the Air Force, they had been at 27 different bases. He started most of them. That was his shtick. He was very good at that. Anyway, so this is my life. This is why I tell stories like this, because I didn't just do one thing and just do it all, because you look at most people, that's all they do. They get stuck in something and that's all they do. Me, I had a zillion things I was all over the place doing, and all these people would see me and go, wow, and then one person would hand me off to another person, and I had so many exposures. So many, New York City is just a cornucopia of diversity, right? And I called New York City not a melting pot, but a salad bowl. Because there was all this diversity that didn't melt into each other. It wasn't Velveeta cheese. It was, basically a salad bowl that all these different flavors were on top of each other to make a better flavor. So that's me. That's why I tell these stories. Because as I tell these stories in parable form, I can, shamanically drop this, information on you guys. So, is anybody there? Kay's there. You're listening. Okay, Kay. I don't have my glasses and I'm blind, so I can't really read. And guys, if you put it in all caps, I could see it. Otherwise, I can't. And I'm blind right now. So see, it's dark. I'm giving you a experiential. This is what I'm experiencing right now. I mean, I can see, but really, this is what when they operated on my eyes today, and it took, because they did both eyes. Normally, they don't do both eyes. And she said, "Your eyes are just in the right place. Where do you think you can put up with this?" And so I had someone inside my eyeball with a laser for 2 hours, 1 hour on my left eye and 1 hour on my right eye. And when I came out of that, I was blinder than a bat. And it took about 3 hours blind in that I couldn't see anything, but, everything was bright. And my eyes were so dilated that even in a dark room, like right now, just a little light on the screen is hurting my eyes. My eyes are still that dilated. And so, they gave me welder's goggles. And she said, first thing, I was the last patient she had, and she was really worn out. And I saw her, and I said, listen, are you in any shape to get inside my eyeballs with lasers? And she goes, I do this 20 times a day. I'm just, I have this new baby, and I have to pick it up and do this. And so I look at her, and I said, here, let me do something. And I got out of the surgical chair. I stood up, and I adjusted her, right? And I showed her certain shamanic stances, and the pain went away. And she, because I could see she was really bad pain, and her whole, picking up the kid and carrying it on her hip, has like turned her side, her hip and her pelvis and her collarbone way out of alignment. And her kneecaps were like, in Texas. So I just got it, and I didn't do a very, shamanic, almost Tai Chi kind of work on her. And it only took me 2 minutes, just bing, bang, boom. And I sat back in a chair, and I put her in a stance, and I got her into a breathing regimen. And she kind of came out of it. She goes, "What'd you just do to me?" I said, "I readjusted you." She goes, "I don't feel, I was in real bad pain, and I don't feel any of it. And I was exhausted, and now I feel like, you know, I'm ready to go." And I said, "Yes." And I wasn't going to let you touch my eyeballs with a laser gun with the shape you were in. So she started out, and she was doing, because I was in state, and I was putting my head exactly where it needed to be for the laser to do its best. Right? She goes, "There's a lot of blood in here, and normally I would never do this, but it's working so great. Can you still stand it?" I said, "Yep, keep going." And 2 hours. And after, she goes, "It's freaking amazing. I've just, normally it would take 4 sessions to do what I just did in 2 hours. And you didn't." And he said, "Most people can't stand this because it's unbelievable bright light. And even though there are no, nerve, like sensory, no pain nerves in your eye, everything around it has stuff that feels this. And what happens is your eyeball it doesn't cook, but, it vibrates. And so it can cause a great headache. And I felt that building up, and I kept stopping her once she got to a place where I knew she was going to stop. I said, "Oh, I'm just going to put my finger up, and then you just don't jump back in. We take a breather." And so I did this, and I got a napkin with cold water, no napkin, paper towel, and I would just put it over my eyebrow, right? And then I said, "I'm doing pretty good at lining up to the angle that you're shooting." I said, she goes, "Yes, that's why I'm being so successful at working on you. It's getting perfect angle." I said, "But you're telling me to look up or look behind. What I think I need to do is, I know in shiatsu and in jujitsu, we use our hands to enable our vision to see past because our eyes normally want to look up, not down. Right? So looking down is hard for people. And looking above that place where you're normally looking above is hard. And to the right, these are all hard things because your eyeball really doesn't have a place that your brain can order it to do things, because it kind of does it symbiotically with the other senses of your body without us even knowing it. So I said, in jiu-jitsu, there's this in shiatsu, in Tai Chi, there's this thing where you put your hand out in front of you, and your intention follows it. So you tell me exactly where you want my eye, and I will put my hand, and I will have my intention. So that's what really enabled. And she was totally blown away, right? So she did 4 different sessions, but that would have taken 8 months, and she did it all in less than 2 hours, right? And that was her last thing. So I said, "So from now on, this is how you pick the kid up," because I was blind. So they led me out of the thing. I had the welding goggles on, and the nurses on one side of me and the doctors on the other side of me, and they are leading me out. And my buddy who brought me there, he stayed in the waiting room for a good, about 40 minutes with me, because they were so piled up. And I, instead of being in there, at 2:30, I didn't get in there until 3:20. And anyway, so that was my day. But my sister, and she had worked in a ophthalmologist office before she had this other work for my brother. And so when I told her she knew the procedure, and all she could talk about was her birthday, and then I did call her on her birthday. Okay? And she really didn't say anything about my eyes. And when we, went to hang up, I said, "Well, you have a good day." And she is, and every time she has a medical problem, she calls me, and I pray and meditate on it. And prayer really does work. Most people don't believe it, but when I was at the VA, um, I had everyone praying for whoever needed the most, like in wards, because I worked in wards, and these guys were coming from Vietnam, and they were messed up. They weren't getting out of that hospital for about a year. And I just had everyone praying, so Bob over here, he's the worst, so let's everyone pray for Bob for the next half hour, right? And it really, there were people would come into those wards and they could feel that prayer. They could feel God right there. And so that's why I have a little issue with, religious people, because they don't even have a clue. And they're ready to castigate anybody. Now, I'm hanging in 3 different churches these days, and they're really tough. And, they haven't burnt me at the cross yet. And I don't ever, they talk smack about each other, but I don't, I'm just sweet and nice. I see it as my vehicle, to sharpen my skills up, my spiritual skills. And that's what I'm being prepared for. My God, I have no idea what I'm to do next, So my eyes are pretty good, right? For having the sun in my eyeballs for 2 hours. They were pretty, I couldn't see anything. Around 8 o'clock, I started seeing things. And I went in my friend's, staying at my friend's, because I was never going to be able to drive from his house to my house. So, I went into his freezer and got a bag of peas and put it above my eyebrow. And then I took I haven't taken a really nice hot shower. I probably have taken a hot shower, 4 of them in the last 5 years. And your body really doesn't need that, right? If you eat the right stuff, you do the right exercise, you stay in the right environment. As cavemen, we didn't have showers, right? Anyway, so I think I'm going to go. There's 2 of you there. I love you. Let's end the prayer. Father, thank you for when 2 come together in your name. There you are. So thanks, God, for being with us. Thanks, Jesus, for being with us. And thanks, Spirit, for being with us. Okay? And who is that at the bottom here? Again, put things in capitals so I can read them. But right now I'm blind, so it's just white fuzz, right? But I love you guys. And I'm going to sleep now. So sweet dreams, all of you.